So each year, over 200,000 people come and visit this museum, and they learn about waves of immigration, waves of Irish immigrants, German immigrants, Jewish and Italian immigrants that made homes in this building that's on our block a few doors down. And you all have little passes so you can come back and go on tours here, and I really hope that you do. And one of the things I'm proudest of is that 50,000 of those people are school children who are coming, and many of those school children are the children of New York City public school children. They are immigrants or the children of immigrants, and when they come and learn about how immigrants shaped the past, they're also understanding their place in our city and in our nation. So we talk about immigration, we make connections from past to present, and we use our free evening public series program, Tenement Talks, to kind of go into more contemporary angles. And so we're so happy that Chimamanda can be here to help us do that, to think about immigration and how that plays out in contemporary America. We have a wonderful season ahead of us, and I hope many of you come back again. March is a season that we started out honoring women, and we have Anya von Bremsen, an immigrant from the former Soviet Union, and her coming with her mother to talk about this amazing cookbook and book of memoirs she wrote. And we have others. It was all women, and then Gary Steingart said he's coming in March, so we couldn't, have him not come. But we also do programs that explore past to present. We have a tribute to Emma Goldman, in which we have current day politicians and writers talk about how Emma Goldman has influenced her life. Poverty is something that is which very much shaped the Lower East Side 100 years ago. Jacob Riis wrote about it. We have a program honoring Jacob Riis and also talking about how the other half still lives today by a writer who's talked about poverty in America. All of these are on little cards that are on your seats, and I really hope you come back and take part in these discussions, both in the discussions we have on tours and then in the space itself. And so I, as an institution, I've done my duty as vice president of this museum and saying why we want Chimamanda here. And now personally, I have to share that I read Kathryn Schulz's wonderful review in mid-June, and the next day basically bought the book and devoured it within 3 days. How many of you had that experience with Americanah? So as soon as I closed the book, in June 18th, I found it in my email chain. I wrote to Random House, please, can we do a program? And I kept writing, and poor Angie Venezia was then given my emails, and she had to deal with me writing every other week, I think, pleading and beseeching her to do the program. So I want to thank her very much for helping us make this happen. And so it took 9 months, the course of a pregnancy, and I'm so excited to welcome. So we have the birth of spring, and we have another birth this week. And I'm just going to briefly introduce both Kathryn Schulz and Chimamanda, and then we'll get started. So Kathryn Schulz is a journalist, an author, and a public speaker. She is the book review editor for New York Magazine. Her freelance writing has appeared in New York Times Magazine, Rolling Stone, Time Magazine, the Boston Globe, The Nation, Foreign Policy, and the New York Times Book Review, among many other publications. And in 2012, she won the National Book Critics Circle's Prize for Excellence in Reviewing. She wrote in her review in June about Americanah that it is a book about identity, nationality, race, difference, loneliness, aspiration, and love, not as distinct entities, but in the complex combinatorial relations they possess in real life. And she also described it as more than the great American novel, it's a great global novel. So high praise, and so we're so excited she could be here. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, aside from being a source of inspiration for Beyonce, is a wonderful... Sorry. So many of you already know this, but it bears repeating. She grew up in Nigeria. Her work has been translated into 30 languages and has appeared in various publications, including The New Yorker, Granta, the O. Henry Prize Stories, the Financial Times, and others. She is the author of the novels Purple Hibiscus, Half of a Yellow Sun, and then also the New York Times notable book, that was describing that one, and the story collection, The Thing Around Your Neck. Americanah, which she'll be talking about tonight, was listed as one of the New York Times 10 best books of 2013, and she just came immediately from a National Book Critics Circle Award event in which she is a finalist, so she's just in from that reading. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Kathryn and Chimamanda.
You guys are cheering for her, and the baby is like responding to me. Can I start us off?
Yes.
Yeah.
So actually, is the poor baby okay?
I first just want to say that it's incredibly delightful to see this crowd. It warms my heart for literature. It warms my heart a little bit just for the world. It, of course, warms my heart for New York, but my heart is always warm for New York. So thank you guys so much for coming out on this slightly disgusting night. And I thought that since we're at the Tenement Museum and in the Lower East Side, it made sense to start out by talking a little bit about immigrant fiction. And one of the things that was most striking to me about Americanah, and that I talk about a little bit in my review, is that, so obviously, the immigrant stories have been incredibly important to America, and likewise, immigrant fiction has been incredibly important to the American literary tradition, and there's a ton of it, and it's very diverse, and it's very interesting. And something that almost never happens in that incredibly diverse body of literature is that an immigrant comes to the United States and at the end of the book goes back home by choice and alive, right? Like that is not a thing that happens in most of the, I'm sure there are exceptions, but I literally could not think of one. And one of the things about Americanah is that we have this journey that in many ways mirrors a very classic immigrant story where a narrator comes, or a figure comes to the United States, and it's tragic and it's triumphant, and there's this constant negotiating of identity, but at the end of the book, ultimately she chooses to return to Nigeria, not because she must, but because it is where she wants to be. And I was curious whether that trajectory was apparent to you from the beginning when you sat down to write this story.
Yes, it was. But just first of all, thank you for coming. It's always nice when people come to things, right? So thank you for coming. Because you never know, right? So thank you. That's actually interesting. Yes, I think I knew, because I knew very vaguely. When I'm writing, I never quite know how my books will end. I kind of have a vague sense of where I'm going. But then that magical thing happens sometimes where things happen in the book that you haven't quite planned. But her going back home was something I think I knew would happen, because I wanted this book to be also about not so much leaving home, but going back, and the many homes and what home means and all of that. And I think it was important that she go back. So yes, I think I knew. Well, I suppose I didn't know what would happen when she did go back, but I knew that she would go back.
Well, and it seems to me that part of what draws her back is a love story that's a real driver of this book, and so in some ways for a kind of narrative satisfaction she had to return. And I actually do want to talk to you later about that love story, which is so lovely. But let's talk a little bit more first about the kind of the immigrant and the going back and forth, because that experience is interesting to me. One of the, I was thinking about Half of a Yellow Sun, which. So if you haven't read it and you've read Americanah, you just have to go read it. I'm going to just stump for your books for 1 minute. They're both incredibly beautiful. They're shockingly different, which is it's just an amazing thing to be able to do as a novelist, to work in these two really different modes. And there's sort of a surface difference between them, which is their subject matter is incredibly different. And Half of a Yellow Sun is about the Biafran War in Nigeria. Americanah is about as you've heard in the introduction, actually about a huge number of things, but certainly one of them is very, very centrally about race in America. And one of the things I was curious about is whether you find it harder or easier is actually a dumb framing. Whether you find, what are the sort of comparative challenges and pleasures and risks in writing about the pathologies of your own country, like a horrifying war, versus the pathologies of a kind of half-adopted country or a foreign country?
Well, writing about America, I have a slight smirk on my face.
It's unnoticeable on the page.
No, I mean, it's interesting though because, Half of a Yellow Sun, the whole Half of a Yellow Sun was so different in so many ways. I was in a different emotional place when I was writing it, and I think I felt that I wasn't just writing about, yet another African pathology. I was writing about my family's memories. I was writing about my grandfathers died in refugee camps. I was writing about that, but with Americanah, I laughed a lot. I was having fun most of the time. And I suppose because I think there's just something that's a bit more fun about poking fun at other people's issues. but there's also, it's not so much. Is something wrong? Did I do something? Oh no. Okay. So in writing about race in the U.S., for example, it's not mine. It's really not mine in the way that I feel that the Biafran story is mine, deeply felt, and it's mine. Race is not mine in that way, but I'm still kind of connected to it because America is kind of my half home. It's my adopted country. It's the rich uncle who gives me money from time to time. So, and I like that uncle very much. So there's a thing about when it's kind of different. You're making fun of that uncle, but when it's about Half of a Yellow Sun and Biafra, it's sort of like your father and your grandfather, and it's a bit more. I think there's a bigger burden of responsibility of sorts.
And that smirk is really, as I was joking, it actually is really evident on the page in a wonderful way, right? There's a sense of real humor behind the really quite deadly portrayal of America. But it's interesting. It seems to me that there's also some of what you're describing about the emotional experience of writing Half of a Yellow Sun versus Americanah seems to me to exist, united within Americanah as well, in that there's this sense all the time that both of these places are so fraught that Nigeria, it's like a heartbroken love, and America is the passionate frustration or the frustrated passion or something like that. And a lot of that plays out in the relationships between these two characters. And so I want to ask you another process question, which is, was it evident to you or how did it become evident to you how you wanted to move them geographically apart and together? Because there's a lot of geography in this book. There's Lagos and there's London and there's various parts of the United States, and then you have this love affair that's moving across those.
I think that's actually true about Americanah. Just saying, the first thing you said, that's actually quite true and interesting. And I'm going to steal that for my next event when somebody asks me a question about. So I'm going to say what you said. But, I really think it was just that it's easy to write about what you know. So I write about all the cities in which I've lived in the U.S. because it's easy to write about them with a certain authority. So I know Princeton and I know New Haven. And the London part was, one of the things I wanted to do with Americanah, in addition to writing about love and hair and race, was that I wanted to to trace a certain trajectory that's familiar to me and many Nigerians like me, but which I don't really see much in literature, in the literature of the immigrant, which is the kind of leaving home not because you have to, but because you want to, because you're longing for choices, because you want more. And for many Nigerians, it's the U.S. But if you don't get a U.S. visa, then you go to England. For my generation of Nigerians, for the older generation, it was the reverse. Yeah. They went to England. Then, if you couldn't get into England, then you went to America. So actually, for my father is 82. For my father, he still has a slight sort of America is not quite it,
It's like Yale instead of Harvard, right?
Yeah, it's second best. But for my generation, America is it. And I wanted to try and capture some of that. So in thinking about writing, because of course I kind of knew that the architecture of the novel would be one in which, they would separate and, sort of the Mills and Boone love story that I wanted to write. They would separate and then they'll come back together. But where they would go, I think, was determined by just a kind of desire to do this socially realist thing of of just trying to capture this experience of my generation. And Obinze's story in England is mostly based on a real story of somebody I know. And I had questioned this person, and I had made notes, and I just had to use all of that material. So Obinze had to go to England.
It's a remarkable story, and one of the things that's most striking about both of those immigrant stories is that they're so not the story America tells itself about its immigrants, right? There's this sense, you get. I love Obinze in the beginning where like Manhattan is everything. It's like it's kind of the like stand-in for all possibility and wonders and wealths, literal and otherwise, of the world, and then they go off to their respective destinations, and in fact, what you see is the progressive crushing of the kind of expectation that they brought into these situations. And of course, even the ultimate leaving, one of them forced and one of them by choice, is also very much not the story that America tells itself about its immigrants. And I'm curious about, actually, one of the things you just said, which is social realism, that you're interested in these social realist novels. So that's actually a really old, conventional, long-standing genre in British and American fiction, one that I admit is very dear to my heart. And it's interesting to use that to tell the kind of story that you're telling, and it actually made me think that it's a little bit like being an immigrant, right? I mean, I guess I'm curious about to what extent you have to sort of reclaim a genre the same way that you have to reclaim a country or make a new country, like make a country your own in that way.
Yeah. I'm quite happily old-fashioned in my literary tastes, and I make no apologies for it. So the kind of, and there's some sort of writing that's called experimental or postmodern that I admire, but it's very hard for me to love. And I grew up a person who loved books. I didn't grow up a person who wanted to be able to be clever about books and talk about them. I wanted to fall in love. And I think there's a sense in which I yearn as a reader for that kind of old-fashioned the kind of stories that are about character, but also about people who exist in a space that's political and social and, like human beings, really. So trying to approximate that. And I think in making the choice to write, but I think what most of my work is like that. And I guess I just write what I like to read. But I also see how, and quite like that reading of it as a reclaiming of a form that very often is seen as, it's a form that's very easy to dismiss. I mean, particularly I think in this country. This is a country where to be experimental is often praised for its own sake. So somebody will say, it's very good because it's experimental. And I'm thinking, no. It's experimental, it can be good or bad, right? It can be, so...
Right, not a logical conjunction between those things. No, well, I'm right there with you. I love a good 19th century novel, and actually one of the things that is so fun about Americanah is, like, it's really a tale, right? Like, it's a story. You feel like it's like someone's reading you a chapter at bedtime every night, and you want them to just keep going and going. And it's actually sort of speaking to the very first question I asked you about kind of this really unconventional immigrant story, where instead of staying and assimilating or making a new life or dying tragically or whatever, you have a return. In a way, it actually felt less like an immigrant story than something like The Ambassadors, like Henry James's book. This one of these stories where someone goes to another country. It's like the sort of classic, one of the really famous classic plot lines is a stranger comes to town, right? Like then that just disrupts everything, and then you build a story around that. And so it has this actually very classical feel that someone comes, and instead of it being a story about assimilation and becoming an American, it's a story about observation. And like, oh, well, I'm going to tell you what I see from my kind of distant but affected perspective, as affected not in the snooty way, the other sense, as a stranger here. And it is so incredibly well done in the book. I mean, the thing that blows me away about Americanah, that smirk that you were experiencing, I mean, I just laughed my way through a huge amount of this book, and not always in a good way, right? In a like, oh, wow, that is like so us, right? It's just like, I hear this. And I want to talk a little bit about that, because a huge amount of that is about race. Like a huge amount of what you do so effectively in this book is show us how race works in America. And it's not even about racism, although I mean certainly there's a lot of discussion in various ways about racism in the book. But it struck me that what it's really about is race as like this incredibly organizing principle of American life, which is exactly what you don't have to see if you're white, right? Like that is the thing that you get to ignore. And that obliviousness is really comfortable and beneficial. And I'm wondering, and it's quite, it tends to go poorly when that's challenged. And I'm wondering how...
That's very delicately put.
Well, but so now you put it indelicately. I'll give you that chance. How was that received?
Right. But you know what? I have to say, though, that I've been pleasantly surprised. When I was working on this book, I had sort of... I wanted to write this book. This is a book I wanted to write. And I suppose all my books, with Half of a Yellow Sun, when I started working on it, lots of people said to me, my family in particular, and they said, leave this alone. Nobody will read it. Nobody cares. It's a part of our history that we should leave it. And I wrote it because I wanted to. And it did well, and I was so happy. And then with Americanah, I figured I'm still getting okay royalty checks from Half of a Yellow Sun. So I can still sort of eat, right, and go shopping. So so I was quite happy to write Americanah and have it not do well. I really didn't think that... I thought the reviews would be bad, particularly in America. I didn't think people would read it because I recognized that there was a sense in which my writing about race in that way would make people uncomfortable. I think I've observed America enough to have concluded that. But it's actually been much better than I thought. I mean, I've been very pleasantly surprised, and in some ways I think maybe I didn't give America enough benefit of the doubt that people actually can have a sense of humor about themselves. Not all. But it's been interesting to me too. I don't read reviews, right? But I do hear back from people, and it's been interesting, for example, that many white Americans who will say to me, "Oh, we love Americanah, but isn't there racism in Nigeria? What about the racism in Nigeria?" and I'm always thinking, but that's not what the book is about, right? It's kind of like, so there's that very interesting sort of just almost sort of defensiveness it's almost autopilot. So they mean well and they're saying they really love the book, but then they can't but say, well, what about you? And in the book, it's one of the things I poke fun at. And I think it's it's a sort of a liberal American thing. Well, I can't really talk about conservative Americans. I don't know very many. I mean, the kinds that watch Fox News. I don't really know many of those, so I can only talk about liberal Americans.
Raise your hand if you're one of those people. Come on.
I mean, I'd like to, because I often watch Fox News just to know what the other side is watching.
How the other half lives.
Yeah, it's important, right? But I don't, and it's interesting because it's people who at least pay lip service to the idea of race as something that exists in the US and as something that is not such a good thing and all of that. But still, the response always is, well, what about your country? Well, don't you have tribalism, and isn't that like racism? Isn't that even worse? And I remember somebody actually writing an email to say, well, what about corruption in your country? And I thought, corruption in my country?
What about Jupiter? I mean, right?
I know. And I remember thinking, corruption in my country, race in America. I don't quite. But it's in many ways also, I think there's it's a silencing mechanism. It's a kind of shut up, you immigrant, and be grateful. And I think that's also what I had in mind about the expectation I had about the novel was I just thought people are going to say, shut up and be grateful. You're allowed to write about African pathology. You're not allowed to write about American pathology. Right? And I just took that right. And yeah.
Well, because African pathology actually is one of the stories that we love to hear and that we tell over and over. It's like one of the only stories that we tell about Africa.
Yes.
Whereas, this story you tell about America is very different from the conventional one. I love this story about your, royalties sort of sustaining you through this process, because in a way it's you can almost tell on the page in that it's the voice of someone who does not give a damn, and it's so pleasurable to read in that sense. And one of the places that voice comes through most clearly is in the blog. So can we talk about the blog?
Yes.
Okay. I am fascinated by the blog. I love the blog. I have many questions about the blog. One of the things I thought about it is that It actually strikes me as an amazingly smart analogy to the immigrant experience in that having an online life and having an offline life, or a quote, real life, let's let the cops go past. um, it, that is a kind of, it's a way to construct and inhabit two identities and to kind of move between them. And that experience is one that I think any immigrant, any person of color, any minority is really familiar with, right? You code switch. Yep. You just talk differently depending on what context you're in. Yep. And I am curious about to what extent that was the sort of deliberate move of the blog, was to show someone doing that kind of moving back and forth between spaces.
You know, it's interesting because Ifemelu who writes the blog is quite different from Ifemelu who's in the book, and the voice of the blog, even for me, is very foreign. So when at some events people have asked me to read from the blog, and I'm always a bit reluctant to, because I don't know how to do the voice. Because it's not mine. Writing it there was something about it that was incredibly freeing. Because it so wasn't... I mean, I agree with most of the blog. About 80% of what's in the blog is really what I think about these things. But the voice of it and the telling was so different. And there's something about it that was freeing. And I think the form and the voice was what made it possible. In other words, I don't think that I would have been as interested as I was in writing the blogs if the voice was different, if Ifemelu sounded like herself, or if it sounded like me. I think I would be caught up in also being an honorary member of the Secret Society of American Liberals. I would be caught up in trying to find a way to balance and to have nuance and to complicate. But with this voice, it's, it was just sort of like, zzz, I'm just doing this and it's fun. And there's something about it that but I think not even just being, an immigrant, being a minority, being even class, that people could switch. And I think for me, I know that I'm speaking like this because I am here and there are lots of people I don't know. So I'm speaking in the voice that my English teacher in secondary school taught me. But if I go back to Nigeria and I go to the market, I will start to talk like this. I'll tell the woman, how much is this thing? I don't like the way that you're telling me this thing, right? And so that there's a kind of, and I think becoming those different versions. So when I'm in Nigeria, I'm even different versions of my Nigerian self. So in the market, I'm a particular version. If I'm somewhere else, I'm another, at the hair salon, I'm a different version. If I'm talking to a driver, I'm a different version. And I think there's something about that idea of performing yourself that interests me very much, and that I wanted to try and kind of explore a bit in Americanah. So when Ifemelu goes back to Nigeria, for example, and she's having to play the madam, she has a driver, she has to sort of do why are you late? I'm going to fire you. But as she's doing that, she doesn't quite believe herself. And in some ways, I borrowed from my own life, because there are times when I'm sort of performing the madam in Nigeria, and I'm just thinking, you're such a fraud. But you have to perform it, otherwise, you just can't, you can't function, nothing will work, you have to. So I'm very interested in those ways and so for Ifemelu, I think that the performance of the blog was a freeing thing for her. It made it possible for her, in many ways for me, to say what needed to be said, to say what I think is important, but what I also think is very absurd. There's just so much about race in America that's just really ridiculous. The way that we're supposed to pretend you're colorblind, right? So you go to a store, and there's actually a part in the book that's based very loosely on what happened to me very early on in the US. We're in a store, there's a black woman and a white woman. They're both dressed in the same way. They both have long hair. Really, the major thing to tell them apart is that one is black and one is white. But then this woman who was asking about them kept saying everything else but race. Do you mean the one with the long hair? You mean the one wearing black? You mean the one...
Well, that is also some good code switching right there, by the way.
And I just remember thinking, the white one, right? But of course, this is America, and you're not supposed to... And for me, it's very interesting what those things mean, because there's... I think for me, it's just that's not... I just don't think it's the solution to the problem. You can't sort of pretend the problem away, and so... But...
Yeah, no, it's an incredibly strange thing about America. I'm going to ask you not the question that I thought I was going to ask next, and it's not even it's a question for you in your capacity as a novelist only insofar as one of the things novelists do for us is observe the world around us and try to make sense of them for us. But it's actually so weird, right? Like I was thinking about gay rights, right? So 30 years ago, if you were queer, like that was an identity that was literally illegal, like so criminal, pathologized. You were like actually mentally ill. And it was a sin. It was like the sort of trifecta of horrible things to be. And somehow in seriously like a generation and a half, that has turned around radically, not perfectly, of course, right? But sort of insane leaps and bounds style progress across basically all demographics in this country. And here we are with race, and it's like you can't say like, oh, the black one, right? And I am curious, and it's making me think about your comment about all these Americans who are like, but what about corruption in Nigeria or tribalism or whatever? There is actually something specific about the racial pathology to America, and like, what the hell is it?
I wish I knew. You tell me you're the American. How about somebody tell me? You know, I think it's just. I think race is America's original sin. I really do. I think that, you know, every country has problems, and so I have to say this to the people who say to me, "Well, what about your country?" And you know, and I come from a place of Nigeria is messed up, right? I know that, but Nigeria being messed up has nothing to do with America also being messed up, and I think in the case of the U.S., and it's very interesting though, because before I came to the U.S., I didn't know. Right, so I consumed American culture. Everybody in the world does, and America was kind of familiar in that way that America is when you watch films and you listen to music. And I kind of knew Black Americans, and sort of Black Americans were cool because, you know, Cosby Show. But then, yeah, the Cosby Show was very popular in Nigeria, and also Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. And I think most Nigerians thought that every Black American was either in the Cosby Show or in Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. And then to come here and to kind of really start to notice that race is so, I mean, class is a problem in America, but not in the way that race is. Gender is a problem, sexuality is a problem, but race is the one thing that is so, it's insidious. And now it's so coded. It's so, you know, now you can't even, it's sort of like you can't talk about the bottle, you have to, you know, somehow refer to the wall. But the bottle is there, you know, it's, and I wish I knew, I mean, I suppose the obvious reason is, you know, America's history, slavery, and that America's I think I'm not American, so please don't send me emails saying I don't have a right to talk about American history, please. But I think it seems to me that the founding thing about American history is the Civil War. And the Civil War was about slavery, you know, no matter what they say on Fox News. And that I find it interesting that it doesn't seem to inform America in the way that you would think it would, if that makes sense. That there's still a kind of just very well-organized denial about how much... I mean, so Ifemelu writes, for example, that the way race is talked about today is sort of like saying, we've locked you up for a crime you didn't commit for 50 years, and now we've let you go, but we're not even going to give you the bus fare, and don't ever complain about, and don't say that anything that happened to you is because of the 50 years you were incarcerated, you know, and let's all pretend that you were never incarcerated. And if you sort of have bad teeth, that's not because you're incarcerated for 50 years, that's just because you're just not clean.
You didn't brush them.
Yeah.
No, and one of the really striking things about the book is its absolute refusal to be complicit in the, like, well, we're talking about that, but here, let's talk about the wall thing. You're like, let's talk about the bottle. And the blog is a lot of how that happens. And one of the things that was interesting to me about it, and you were just referencing this, is that Ifemelu as a voice in the book, she's so fierce, and she's so intelligent, and she's so observant, and she's a little naive, right? She's much less sophisticated than the authorial voice, and it's striking, right? Because what we see her doing is writing in the blog, and of course we see you writing also, and those writerly voices are very, very different. And I'm wondering, you know, you said you sort of agree with 80% of the blog. I'm wondering kind of what that wedge is between you and her, and it sounds like it gave you kind of liberty to write. Did it also, like, how did it kind of shape your sense of her character?
It's very interesting. I think she is naive. Yes, there's a certain. Yeah, Ifemelu is a character I admire very much. A character I liked. A character that she's. It's been interesting. I think many people have read her as me, which I don't mind really, but she's not me. And um, I think I wanted her to be. I suppose in some ways I also was manipulative with her because it was very important to me that she challenged many ideas of what gender is supposed to be, right? So I wanted her to be, so she's the person who's in a good relationship, but she cheats, and she cheats because she's curious, right? And that was deliberate on my part. I made the character do that but actually she also wanted to, I think. But yeah, she wanted to. But, but also just because women are not supposed to cheat because they're curious or they're bored. They're supposed to cheat because, the man isn't present. And so I've heard from many women who've said they don't like her. Because women have said to me, but, she had a good man who loved her. Why wasn't she grateful? And it's true, and my thing is I want a world where more women are not grateful. Right? I think Ifemelu, yeah, but of course every character that I write is me in a way, and I think that actually I think Obinze is a lot more. I
was right about to ask you that actually.
Yeah, I think I've used a lot more of me in Obinze. I think Obinze's yeah. He's idealized. I'm not nearly as perfect as he is, haha. But the kind of the kind of person who sort of sits aside and mourns things that could have been. Yeah, I actually waste a lot of time doing that sort of thing.
And he felt to me like the one thread in a way between Half of a Yellow Sun and Americanah. There is something about him, and it's tonal more than anything else. There's this kind of loyal, nostalgic, romantic, highly intellectual, but sort of slightly distraught with every country, with the sort of context that he's been placed in. He's a lovely character. I really adored him. Actually, I was sort of. I was always fascinated to be in America because I was like, wow, look at our country, we're freaks. But I missed him whenever he wasn't on the page, and of course he's not on the page in America.
Well, Americans are not freaks. Not all of you.
Thank you.
Can I just say I really like America because I really don't want to get any angry emails. I get too many as it is. I'm very grateful for my rich uncle who gives me pocket money, even if he doesn't always remember my name. But Kathryn, but you, I just think you're an amazing reader.
Well, that's awfully nice of you.
Because I think that idea of Obinze and really what you've said, I think that's very true. There's a tonal similarity. Even for me in writing it, when I wrote Obinze, I was in a different place. When I wrote Ifemelu laughing, and I had that smirk, but I wrote Obinze, I was, I don't know, I was kind of, I was holding my spirit, and in the way that I was when I wrote Half of a Yellow Sun, so, yeah.
That's a lovely image. I'm curious actually about the practical end of that. Were you literally in different places where, did you write this book mostly in America and Nigeria? Do you write differently in those places?
No, it really doesn't matter where I am. I need space, silence, light, and food. And, but with Americanah, actually I wrote most of it when I was doing the fellowship at Harvard. That's where I finally just sat down and sort of finished the book. But I'd been writing it for a long time, and I write wherever I can and wherever it happens, because I keep hoping that writing will happen. It doesn't happen as often as I would like. I'm just worried about slipping off this chair. But with Half of a Yellow Sun, which was different, there were times when I needed to go back to, not just to Nigeria, but to my ancestral hometown to write some parts. There are times when I just needed to be there. I needed to walk the streets, the roads that my grandfather had walked. So it was really, place was much more important to me in writing Half of a Yellow Sun. But with Americanah, I wrote it at Cambridge. I wrote it in Nigeria, in Lagos. I wrote bits of it in my parents' house in Osaka. Wherever I wrote bits of it in London when I was staying with my brother. And actually in London, it was important for me to go to London because I had kind of forgotten. I needed to go. I visit often, but when I was writing Obinza's sections, there was a certain moodiness to sort of walking to the Tube, to going to that Starbucks, and I wanted to do that. So I sort of went and I walked around just to get that sense. And so I wrote most of Obinza's sections when I was in London. Yeah.
Can we talk about bodies?
Okay.
No, or maybe just sex, really? No, one of the things I really love about this book is it's so embodied, actually. It's even kind of the cameos. You get people standing on train platforms, and they're so amazing looking, and you're like, wow, I've seen that woman in that miniskirt on this train platform. Who knew you were standing over my shoulder? It's interesting because it's another axis on which... It's like race, right? It's we present it to the world. There's no getting around other people seeing it, knowing it, bringing their own life history to it, and interacting with it. But it's a bit more private and specific because race, we've got this kind of dominant narrative, and whether you yourself, it's like interrupt.
But there's also a dominant narrative about bodies.
Well, for sure. I'm just curious about. Sort of when you start creating these characters, where do you is the body there from the get-go? Is the voice there from the get-go? Is this personality or soul or whatever you want to call it? How does that emerge?
I wish I knew. I don't think my process is entirely conscious. I really don't know. I think that's the most honest answer. I mean, I have invented answers because I imagine I'll be asked this sort of thing, but yeah, so I have to invent answers. But really, I don't. I do think, though, going to the part about bodies. So when the book starts, Ifemele is fat, and again, I wanted to write about. I'm very interested obviously, in gender, and I'm a very happy feminist and all of that, and I'm very interested in the dominant narrative of what femininity is, what gender is, and not just in the US, everywhere in the world, because it's becoming this incredibly homogenized world where young women in Nigeria are watching, I don't know, America's Next Top Model or something, and everybody, and I think one of the things that struck me early on in America was, why is saying somebody's fat? Why is that a legitimate insult? I'm like, why? I don't know. And in Nigeria, it isn't. I mean, that's changing a bit. But the idea of a woman who has flesh on her bones is actually often a good thing where I come from. And I remember coming to the US, and it was one of the first classes in college as an undergrad, and the professor said, guess which is the biggest industry in America, something like that. And everybody said, weight loss industry. And I remember thinking, really? It was such a revelation to me, and I was shocked. And I thought when they said that, surely they're wrong, it can't be. And she said, oh, yes, of course it is. And I thought, really? And so, and then to watch and see how, the things that in this country, there's a lot of self-censorship in America, which I find very interesting, because America also tells itself the story of all its freedoms, but there's so many things you're not supposed to say. There's so many things you're supposed to swallow. And somebody's laughing because he's remembering all the things he's swallowed. And I just wanted to challenge the idea of, when she goes back to Lagos and she doesn't want to call him because she wants to lose weight first, which I think is something many women identify with. And then she finally sees him, and I wanted her to, at some point to, maybe outside of sort of the weight thing, just say, fuck it, I'm going to be who I am, kind of thing. And yeah, so I think bodies are important. And I kind of like the idea of a world of diverse bodies, different kinds.
Well, and it is really striking in the book. It functions very much like the failure of the shopkeeper to say, like, oh, the black one, oh, the white one, in that, you talk about how someone is large but they're not fat, and there's all this kind of moral freight to these words, which I really appreciate, because I spent a couple of years in Latin America, and I had this wonderful group of friends in Santiago, Chile, and at a certain point you just get used to it, but like everybody there goes by a nickname, and that nickname is like flaca, gorda. You're like the skinny one, the fat one. Like that is just that is the terminology that people use with each other. And you would just never in the United States. I mean, people do say "Hey, fatso," and they say it as a playground insult, right?
Yeah.
And that sort of calling out of everything, right? There's a way that the kind of, in some ways, almost the engine of revelation in the book is just the naming of the obvious. Like there's a kind of emperor's new clothes quality to it that's really incredible and very fun to watch. I want to ask you about language a tiny bit, and I'll start actually slightly astray from there, or with a bridge between noticing things about America and language. There are 3 moments in this book when you identify something as incredibly American, and I love them all. One of them is right at the very beginning. You make this observation that I had never noticed, which is that when Americans say, when we want to say I agree, we say I know. Which is actually really interesting, right? It's like essentially we're asserting like, I beat you there, right? Like I got it, or I'm not quite sure what we're doing, but we're doing something weird. And then there's 2 other moments in the book where you identify a word as being somehow like fundamentally and essentially American. And those 2 words, and they occur in different contexts in the book. One of them is trooper, and the other is blowhard. And I'm wondering if you can actually just say a little bit about like why I know trooper or blowhard. Like what are you hearing and tell us what you're seeing.
I don't know what the heck those words mean. That's why I think I should have added Twinkie. I still don't know what the heck a Twinkie is. The trooper actually came from, Blowhard came from a friend of mine who was telling me a story. Because in this novel, I've really used people's stories. I've used so many stories from people, but I've sort of shaped them and done things to them, which is why my friends read the book and then they say, I told you that, but that's not quite how it happened. And then
I'm a novelist.
I'm like, I know, that's... But Trooper actually came from my own experience, because I did some babysitting when I was an undergrad. Nothing as exciting as Ephemelos, sadly. But I do remember one of the parents of of Stephen, who I took care of. He had a friend, and the friend's parent. It was sort of a circle of, upper middle class, happy, optimistic Americans who would say to their kids everything was great, and they had lots of projects, and you're a trooper, and I just remember. Just thinking, I don't even know what... I mean, I just thought, who else in the world says trooper? I mean, I don't...
That's what's so beautiful about it, right? It's actually so astute. As an American, I read that and I'm like, there is something that is capturing, in combination, Blowhard and Trooper is capturing us kind of at our best and our worst in this way that I just really appreciated. And so that kind of brings me to the question of ear, right? One of the, in addition to the wonderful kind of 19th century novel like qualities of this book, it's just you're a lovely writer, and sentence by sentence it's a pleasure. And I'm curious about to what extent English is spoken so differently around the world, and you obviously inhabit really, really different Englishes, and presumably also Igbo, and for all I know, you speak 7 languages. Talk to me a little bit about
I wish.
Right. Talk to me about how that kind of linguistic diversity, even within English, affects you as a writer.
I think that's actually I often say that now, having grown up in Nigeria and been educated in Nigeria, where the language of education is English, and it's very sort of British leaning. So we spell color with a U. And then having come to the US to go to college, where I had to type my assignments, so the computer kept changing the spellings for me. Until now, I spell the American way. And now actually I can't spell. Is what's happened.
Like all of us, right?
So this is the thing about me that's become Americanized. I really cannot spell, and I could spell perfectly before. And now it's terrible. And now the few times when I do write things, I recently wrote something for my father. I wrote sort of a thing, and I wanted him to look at it. And my father carefully went around correcting the American spellings, adding U to color, and in that way, I think that I don't know where I find myself sort of. I'm inhabiting many Nigerian Englishes, but I'm also inhabiting American and British Englishes in a way that I just feel messed up in my head sometimes. So I remember recently talking to a friend of mine who's English, and I said different than. And he was horrified, and I was horrified, because I didn't know that this is a construction that has somehow seeped into me. And so I said, oh, it's different than. And he said, what did you say? And then I was like, oh, my Lord, so now I say that. That's terribly American, right? And so I think that even my writing, I'm sure, is messed up in that way, where I just have, I don't even know what I'm saying when I'm saying things. But there are parts where I want to capture a certain kind of Nigerian Englishness. And there, sometimes in the dialogue in particular, it's not just that, I want to write about characters who are speaking both Igbo and English, which is what I and many people in my world do. We speak Igbo and English, or Yoruba and English, or Hausa and English at the same time, often in the same sentence, and I want to capture that. But also, there's a kind of Nigerian English that has its own syntax that to an ear that isn't used to it can sound a bit awkward. And I sometimes want to try and capture that as well when the characters are talking, which is often the bits where my editor will underline and be like, did you mean this? And I say, yes, I meant that. And I think there's just, now that English has this ridiculous power in the world, I'm very happy I'm an English speaker, because it just makes life easier, right? I think in the way that 200 years ago French speakers must have felt very... So you go to every country, and I actually get annoyed if I don't see the signs in English. And then I think this is ridiculous. Why the fuck should they have English signs, But then you expect them to in that way that... So I think for me, it's... I don't know, I like to think of my writing as a kind of an engagement with the different Englishes of the world. Yeah, if that makes sense, yeah.
Oh, it's lovely, and it's a way to engage with the different... language is how we express and invent ourselves, so it's really just a way to engage with the different peoples of the world. You're looking at me like I should let the audience ask questions. Is that right? Okay.
But before we do we have the microphone? I'm going to jump up while we get it and ask a question, too. So, I have been living in New York for 20 years and kind of forgot. I take New York for granted sometimes, and I had to go to a conference I think it was in D.C., and at the end of the conference, they're like, let's all take a group picture, and I'm like, I want to get back on the train. But there were 40 people there, and the photographer was moving people around to get people. So you with the red shirt, move over there. You with the hair, I can't see you. And it made me think again about Americanah and how you use hair. And it's not the most important part of the book, but it was one that really struck me and made me think, and I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit, how you came to talk about hair, what you think it has to say about America and Nigeria.
Ooh, I don't know how much time we have. Right, so I wrote about hair because it's a very personal thing. I have a thing about hair, and it's a thing. By which I mean that I spend way too much time watching YouTube videos of women talking about their natural hair. And please, the women here, can you confess if you're like me? So you're like, hey, this is Shanita coming at you from Atlanta. And then they're like, this is the new shea butter that I found. You can see that it has like a curl pattern here. And I just sit and watch this. It's terrible, but I actually want. I think there's a wonderful subculture of women of African descent who are choosing to wear their hair natural. I think it's a wonderful sort of. I want to write an essay about it. It's just really a fantastic subculture that says a lot about politics. But I think hair is not just hair. I think hair, and I think that's particularly for women, right? The men, I love you all dearly, but, you can be bald and do whatever you want, and that's fine. But imagine if Diane Sawyer decided to stop coloring her hair. It would be a problem. It would be a problem. And so I think for white women, color. For black women, it's much bigger. It's texture. It's a question of texture. It's that, well, yeah. But here's the thing. Curly is, in general, not good, right? But the acceptable curly is the white people kind of curly. Yeah, so that's the kind. So in the women's magazines, when they tell you how to care for your hair, straight, wavy, curly. And then I'm looking there thinking, I can't use any of this, and I really would like to know what I can use, but I'm not here because there's no kinky. This doesn't work, right? Even though some of the curly, we could actually use some products. And Well, so in Americanah, Ifemelo has some suggestions for white sister friends who have seriously curly hair. Because generally, you can do the same things. You can't too. Cause, when it's wet, if you do cornrows, it'll. But no, it's true though. It's true. But I think that hair. I think hair is such a thing. And I started to, when I was growing up in Nigeria, and in many ways it's also a personal story for me. When I was growing up in Nigeria, I didn't really think about hair. I didn't need to. I didn't think about many things. And I think the reason I started to think about hair here is perhaps because I also discovered race. And I think both were linked. And it just became, straightening my hair. My sister said to me, "You're going for this interview for the internship. Make sure you take out the braids and straighten your hair so you look professional." And I thought, oh, okay. So I went and I did that. But at some point, I started to think, why do I have to straighten my hair to look professional? Why do I have to go through all of this, to put lye in my hair, to go through the possibility of scalp burns so that I can look professional? And I think for me, then it became about questioning who determines what professional is, and why do we live in a world where professional is defined so narrowly? And I just had this moment where I thought, I'm not doing this anymore. That's it, right? And I stopped. But and I wish I could say that I lived happily ever after. But this would be a lie, because it took a long time for me to come to feel comfortable wearing my hair the way it grows from my head. When I stopped straightening my hair, I felt ugly. I then started to invest in many turbans because I just thought, this can pass as being stylish, but nobody will know I'm actually just hiding the fact that wearing my kinky hair makes me feel like I'm just not very attractive. And so it took a while. It took a while, but so I wanted to write about that in Ifemelu's journey as well, because in some ways it's not just hair. It's coming into a fullness of yourself. It's about coming into your own. It's about owning yourself as you are. And I felt like I had sort of done that, and I kind of wanted my character to do that as well. And yeah.
Can I just say one thing about that? It's so interesting about hair and race, because so there's the angle you're describing, which is the pressure, which is sort of a complicated intersection of race and gender, that you need to look a certain way, and obviously, so it plays out kind of on that dimension of race. But I was also really struck by how it's also, we spend a lot of time intermittently in the book in this hair salon in Trenton. Are we in Trenton? Where are we? And I was so struck by how it's like not only a totally race-segregated space, but it's actually the kind of space, it's such a kind of great and precise example of obliviousness to how people different than you live, right? It's a wonderful way to show, like, wow, this is just like a space you've never inhabited, literally and otherwise, and it works so well that way in the book.
And yeah, and I because I have visited so many hair braiding salons, I just had to write about them in the book. And actually, it's much of the hair braiding bits actually did happen, in the sense that I did in fact have this. I did not help her talk. I didn't help to get her married, as Ifemelu offers to. But this woman who had a skin condition, and she was from Senegal. And it's just very interesting for me, because again, it's a kind of subculture. The West African women, and they're mostly West African, in the hair braiding salons all across America. It's also a thing. There's the boss. It's almost like a mafia, actually, a very mild mafia. And then the people who work there, and you can tell who speaks the best English, who's sort of in charge, and there's just a lot of, and then they have these conversations. And for me, the most fascinating thing is watching them become different versions of themselves. So when an African American woman comes into the shop, they're different. When another African comes in, they're different. And it's just really interesting watching them just navigate these spaces, and they're constantly on the phone sending Western Union numbers to somebody in Senegal, in Mali, in Guinea, in Ghana, and but I did want to say one just last thing about hair, that if Michelle Obama, when Obama was running for president the first time, or even the second time, if she suddenly woke up and thought, I'm not going to do this hair straightening thing anymore, I'm going to just let my hair, I'm going to maybe get dreads. Can you imagine what would happen? they'd be like, Black Panther! She, she, has, she has a gun. And I don't think that he would win. I mean, seriously, he would not win. He just wouldn't. And I think even well-meaning, progressive-minded people might be concerned, because I think there's also a thing about black hair in which it's weighted with meaning unnecessarily. So if she had the dreads, which simply might be that she doesn't want to have to deal with, an afro or loose hair, so she gets her hair dreaded, which is simply the way that her hair grows on her head. But I think for many people it would mean something.
Identity, which is exactly what you're not supposed to be doing,
yeah.
Right?
And it would, I think, automatically also mean that Obama was suspect in some way. You couldn't entirely trust him. Because, if he's married to a woman who has dreadlocks, you just never know what else he's going to do.
Do we have questions from the audience? And, please wait till you get the microphone, but Elisheva will bring it to you.
Hi. Speaking about hair, I just wanted to ask you, what do you feel about, 2 years ago, when Viola Davis showed up at the Oscars with her natural hair, I was cheering. And now we have somebody like Lupita Nyong'o. What do you feel about her?
Oh, I love her.
Oh. That's a good answer.
Yeah. And Lupita and I might be having an announcement to make soon. I'm not saying anymore. It might or might not be about Americanah. I'm not saying. But no, I love it. But I also was cheering for Viola Davis, and I think even that is very telling, because people who got how much courage it took, how it was really an act of bravery, how it was a political act that a woman decides to come out with her hair the way God made it grow on her head. When you think about the absurdity of it. But yes, I was cheering, and I think the reason that I'm so excited about just that Lupita has become this star, this sort of shining thing in the universe, is that she, again, she's talented, and all of that, and that is true, but she's also different. She has the looks that the world tells us we're not supposed to aspire to. And that makes me very proud and very happy, because I think about all the young girls out there in the world who think they all have to look like Halle Berry, and it's wonderful that that Lupita is and she's also really stunning. And when I'm bored, I go online to look at what she's wearing.
Yes, I don't have a question. I just wanted to tell you how grateful I am and for the bravery you had in writing this book and observing my country, the United States, from your perspective. I'm a professor of sociology, and I teach occasionally a course called Race and Ethnic Relations. And I speak, I think, for most professors who teach courses like that. Thank you, because your book allows us to open up all those difficult conversations, all those difficult topics that students in the United States need to be addressing and learning about and talking about. And you do it so magnificently well in the book. But it's an invitation in the book to talk about it. And so I had my students all imitate Ifemelu's blog, and they all wrote blog posts kind of in that spirit. And so I have a student here with me from the class, and I hope all the rest of them are watching online, but thank you so much.
Thank you. That means very much to me. Thank you.
Hi. So, can you guys hear me? Yeah. So I am actually in the States, having gone to college here, and I never thought of that story as an immigrant story until I came here today, because I always knew it'd be temporary and that I would move back. But my question for you, though, is you touched on the non-American black perspective on race. And I also just kind of never got it. But your book was actually really educational. But one thing you call, I think, Caribbean people always on is that sense of Caribbean pride, but separating it a little bit from being black. And did you talk to some friends of yours from the Caribbean?
Yes. Yes, and I'm also, I make fun of my friends from the Caribbean about inter-Caribbean bullshit that goes on. And we sort of, I'll often say that we're all messed up. Africans are messed up, Caribbeans are messed up, African Americans are messed up, white Americans are messed up. We're all messed up. But there's a particular kind of messed up that in the Caribbean. I remember when I went to Jamaica and people were like, the red-skinned man. And I thought, what's that? So there's a lot of, there's a kind of, and I suppose, again, obviously because of the history is different, but there's a kind of racial thing, an awareness, a color hierarchy that really is alien to me as a West African, right? But I think in the U.S., Caribbean immigrants and African immigrants, I think many of us come here, we internalize all the horrible stereotypes about blackness, and then in some ways we start to perform the good black. We start to do I'm black, but I'm the good one because I don't have the issues, and there's something about it that. I mean, it's not even about blaming people. It's about that it's a structural thing. It's a shame that this is a society in which people feel compelled to want to say I'm the good black. But I also feel that many of us, the non-American blacks, are not honest about it. There's a kind of, when I'm with Nigerian Americans and Nigerian immigrants, and I talk about this sort of thing, they're very dismissive. And then I become the kind of school teacher who says things to them like, well, the only reason you can come here and work as a doctor is because African Americans marched on the streets for, and then they kind of look at me like, oh, please. But I think a lot more of that is, I think it's important. I think, but also I wanted Americanah to be a book about how the different blacks, the different ways of being black. But I think America doesn't know that. So America thinks that if you're dark, then aren't you all the same? So that we all experience race differently, I think is often news to people. Actually, where was I 2 days ago? And a very nice white American man said to me, he said, I listened to an interview that you gave and you said you weren't black. Is that because you didn't have the attitude? And I was staring at him. I was like, I thought, right. So in his estimation, so I said to him, look, first of all, I'm black. I'm very happily black, right? But also this idea that somehow, in his mind, all of you who are dark are black, and all of you have the attitude. And I just thought, what nonsense. But I. Yeah, but I wanted just to really quickly say that for me, Americanah is really about the many ways of being black, the many ways of experiencing blackness, because they're different. I think they're different even for somebody who's a Caribbean immigrant, for somebody who's an African immigrant. And I think it's also different for somebody who's West African, where race doesn't really exist for us as a social force, and somebody who's East African or Southern African, where race exists as a social force. When you come here, you experience it very differently. Nigerians are often oblivious about race. Were you? Yeah, Nigerians are just often completely oblivious. And it can be problematic, especially when they're raising kids in America. So they're raising kids who are growing up knowing they're black. But their parents are like, what is black? And so I'm hoping that sort of, that Americanah is about, because I know that when I came, I did that sort of, I'm not black. No, don't, I'm not. And the guy who said to me, hey, sister, I'm like, I'm not, no, you're not my brother. And I was like, don't even go there. And when I think about it now, and one of the conversations I really am interested in having with lots of people is, why did I react that way? Why did I say I'm not black? Because it's an indictment of America. It's because, you come here and you immediately know you don't want to be black, right? And now that I'm very happily black, but also it was a journey, and I wanted that to be Femelu's journey as well, and for Americanah to say, yes, we're black, we're happily black, there are many ways of being black, but can we also just try and stop this nonsense where black is not a good thing, Sorry.
Right.
No.
Oh, now I do have a mic. Right, obviously, of course, the reason people, like non-black Americans who come to America don't want to be black is because it's just totally, set up as a negative thing here. But it's also really awkward to have an identity foisted upon you, whatever that identity is, right? Yeah. It's so, I remember I went to Cuba once, and after about a week in Cuba, I was like, I'm a capitalist. I had no idea, right? Because there's these things you don't know about, not by choice necessarily, not because I think it's the best system in the world, but because I grew up with it, and I'm like, oh, right. I literally don't understand how the world works when you remove that. How do you people even get married. I don't know. So there's a way that I think just having it's and I see it a lot in the book, and that's what's lovely about the taxonomizing of race, right? Is you see like all these there's so many ways to inhabit that identity, and I think a lot of the struggle of the book and the sort of beauty of it is actually to try to get to like, but who are, like, what's your chosen identity, right? And who do you love? And that's part of why it's a love story.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I mean, I really like that about you being a capitalist. How did they make you aware of that identity? Did they
actually because
ask you about the market?
No, it wasn't. No, although right, I mean the whole for sure like the way that you get treated as an American in Cuba or did is right. It's very odd. It's actually not analogous at all to how you get treated as a non-black American in America. But no, the way I realized it was that I didn't understand how anything worked. It was like, I need food. How do I acquire food? Like, so you two are getting married, but you can't just go like buy an apartment. So like what? I mean, every single structure of society, and at that point you realize like, the logic of the world that I know is totally bound up in this system that was invisible to me until now, and that's actually quite a lot how race works up right in the U.S. as well.
Yep. You don't have a choice though, because Sorry.
So we also have questions from upstairs for the group of people. Again, a shout out to all of you upstairs. Elisa, would you want to read the question?
I'm going to do one question from upstairs. You write about love so often in your novels. However, growing up as Nigerian, I find that love is not something spoken of, particularly romantic love. Where do you find your inspiration for the love between your characters?
Mills and Boone, apparently.
That's it. I don't know how old this person is, because if this person is of my generation, they read Mills and Boone. No, but seriously, of course love is spoken of in Nigeria. I think, though, that again, it's that idea when people will say things like, my parents didn't say I love you when I was growing up. And I just think, but just because Americans have told you that's what parents should say doesn't mean that your parents didn't show you their love. So when I was growing up, my family was actually quite normal and boringly happy. And I felt deeply, deeply loved. But my parents didn't say I love you. And so I think maybe Nigerians don't do romantic love in the way, Ifemelu, for example. No, actually, it's another character who I put that in his mouth, where he says, you come to the US and, couples are very coupley in public. They hold hands. It's like, they can't let go. They hug every minute. And in Nigeria, people don't do that. But it doesn't mean they love each other any less. It's just a different way of... So I don't need to go away from Nigeria to find inspiration for love. It's in Nigeria. It's just maybe not the overt Americanized kind. That,
I think we have time for one more question.
Hello. I actually found out about your book through Twitter, social media, and I read it last week.
You could use a microphone closer.
And I read it last week, and I loved it. And I loved, like, Ifamulu, when she would, when she came to America, she said she didn't know she was black until she got here. Because, like, when I went to boarding school, I'm Hispanic, and everyone was like, so you're black? And I was like, I am. Like, I was like, oh, sure. I didn't know. Well, and one of my favorite things about the book was the love story. And in the end, I was like, I have to know more. Like, I hope. So so one of my questions is there going to be a sequel? And I hope there is, because I really want to know. Like, I loved it. Thanks.
Well, now that you've suggested it, actually, I've been thinking about what I've been thinking about lately, because is that I'm thinking I might continue Femelu's blog in her voice. So I'm kind of thinking about that, but I don't know. I don't think in my work, I don't think of sequels, because for me, when a book is finished, I kind of let the characters go. So I don't know. But then I also never say never. So I don't know. But thank you, and I'll keep it in mind.
And I know there's many people here who have books. Okay, one more question back there, because I can't resist the...
Hi, so it's more of a comment. I just want to say a very big thank you, because you gave a voice to many, many of the Ifemelus that are here in the U.S. living that experience, and I'm one of them, and I will go back to Nigeria out of choice. So it was amazing to read that in print, and it was real. And the one day that I read it in, because I read it in one day, it was like, the way you read Jane Austen, and you're not reading out loud, but you're reading in a British accent to yourself, but you don't know. But then I read Americanah, and I'm reading in my Nigerian accent in my head, because it's like you're in my room talking to me. It was incredible.
Thank you. That's the loveliest thing to say. Thank you.
It looks like you have something to say.
I'm Nigerian too, so I grew up in Nigeria. I'm a big fan of Chimamanda. I came with my mom actually. She read the book first day, finished everything. And my wife is also here, and I'm a big fan of an artist, and I made it work for you. I want to give you half a
That's really nice. Okay.
Thank you, my Nigerian brother. Thank you.